stuff. Companies are hiring talented developers. If you're interested, come talk to us. So you can just feel yourself at home and just welcome, and we're glad you guys are here.
All right, we also have AV support and equipment from Symphono. They provided a lot of this equipment that we're using here. Also, some of it is just John's on his own. So we appreciate John coming and spending his time with us to record these. The food today came from Domino's. You want to come up here and talk about what you guys do, and if you're looking for any developers, I think
we might be looking for developers. Yeah, so I'm Jason from Domino's. I lead the web team for our store systems platform. And what that means is anything that you would see as a team member in store, that ranges about 12 to 15 apps or continuously adding more on. That's something like your order entry to the make line, what the team members looks at as in building out the pizza and then dispatching it to the drivers. So we're using React, Redux, GraphQL, all greenfield technologies. So if that's of any interest to you or you'd like to find out more information, I'll be in the back. I'll hang around for a little bit after the meetup as well. Or you can go out to jobs.domino's.com. We're currently hiring all skill levels of developers. Thank you.
awesome. Thank you. Cool. So we also have some giveaways at the end of the meetup. I am going to ask our speaker to think of 2 questions that he can ask to the audience, to you, at the end, to see if you're paying attention. Whoever raises their hand and gets the question right will get a JetBrains license for any of their products for 1 year, and another giveaway for a t-shirt, one of these guys. If your company is interested in sponsoring Some.js and getting up here and giving a pitch and getting access to anyone who emails looking for jobs, send us a note at sponsors@some.js.org. So we have meetups the second Monday of every month. So the date itself can change, but it's always on a Monday. It's always the second one of the month. The location also changes. So it's best to look at the meetup.com event itself to see where the meetup is going to be. Our next one will be February 11th, talking about scaling and productivity and I think some design systems or something like that. So it should be a really cool talk. I'm looking forward to it. If you are interested in speaking, let us know. Get in touch with me or Ryan, or send us a note to speakers@somjs.org. We also look for lightning talks. It can be a 5-minute introduction to a topic, just to get people interested in something. If you've got something you're playing around with, we're always happy to do lightning talks at the beginning of our events. Another thing that Some.js does is the study group. So whereas this is a large sort of information projection type of event, the study group is much more small and intimate. Previously, they were always being held at Pillar, at one location. That will no longer be the case this year. Pillar was acquired by another company, and yada yada. We're spreading it out now. So just like for the main meetups, to know where it's going to be, check the meetup event on meetup.com to find the location. I think the first few this year will be at Pillar, and then they'll be moving around a little bit. There's a conference coming up in Columbus, and it's not really coming up, I guess. It's still a ways away, but they have a call for speakers right now. So if you are interested in getting out in front of other JavaScript developers and practicing your conference talks, well, if you want to practice them, come here. If you want to give one, I guess, go to this one and submit a talk. I don't know, Ryan, do you want to give any other pitch for that?
The spoiler is the call for speakers opens tonight at midnight.
Okay. All right, so get them ready. Does anybody know of anything else cool going on in the tech community around here? Yes.
One of the Google developer experts just recently launched an Angular meetup here in Ann Arbor, so that might be of interest to the group. It's on meetup under Angular Ann Arbor.
Awesome.
And the planned meetup is usually like the week before this one on Wednesday nights, but check the meetup page for the next event.
Awesome. New AngularJS or Angular meetup. I'm not an Angular developer. I don't understand what they're saying. I just know that AngularJS is different from Angular. I don't know which one's which. Is there anything else? Anybody knows about? All right. So one other thing we do here is connect developers to sponsors who are looking to hire developers. That is how I got my current job at Nutshell. I sent an email to jobs@sunjs.org. They put me in touch with a few different companies around here. I emailed them, let them know I was looking for something, and got a job. So it's a great opportunity if you're not completely satisfied with what you're doing now, or you're interested in a change. Send us an email and we'll see what we can do. Also, one thing that I've been kind of kicking around a little bit, I think it'd be awesome if we could have like our own little private jobs board. So if anyone is interested in like doing a little project and trying some new technology they want to play around with, or wants to help out, basically, it could be a fun little project to do. So let me know if you're interested in making a jobs board, and we can talk about it. Otherwise, I may have to, but I don't have a lot of time. All right, after this meetup, we will be going to Marsh, just 2-3 blocks down the road on Washington. So it's a great chance to sort of get together, talk, get to know some other developers. It's one of my favorite parts of the meetup is just to hang around and talk and chat. So that's where we'll be headed. I hope you all are able to attend. All right, and if I can ask Kevin to come on up, he's going to tell us about Gatsby.js and building static sites with Gatsby. Give him a warm welcome.
Is there possible I can move?
Yes,
that?
absolutely. I'm taking this.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by just thanking you for all giving me your time and attention. And just a quick poll, kind of get the temperature of the room here. How many people are familiar with static site generators as a concept? Okay. How many use them like day to day? Anybody use Gatsby? Okay, good. So in some ways, static site generators are kind of a bit of a step back in kind of the evolution of how we generate content for the web. In the beginning, it's all we had. So we hand-wrote HTML files, we FTP'd them to a server, that was it. Then we got fancy with CGI bin and dynamically generating pages on the fly. And then we started putting content in a database, and then WordPress came along. Then we started doing like 40, 50 SQL queries per page every time someone loaded a page. And then it got slower and slower and slower. And then we got hacked. So, but really like 30% of the internet runs on WordPress. And there have been at least 275 vulnerabilities published since 2003. So static site generators, by building pages up front, and not waiting until a browser requests the content, we can use dumb but fast and secure servers to serve content to our users. And we can also put those on CDNs so that the process can be super fast for anyone in the world. So Gatsby is a static site generator. It's written in JavaScript, uses React, uses webpack and GraphQL. Part of the Jam stack. So it's got all those buzzwords like kind of all in one. And really, I've been a fan of static site generators mostly in the Ruby world, using Jekyll and some of those other ones. And Ryan told me about Gatsby, and I rolled my eyes because, of course, everything has to be rewritten in React now. But I actually took a look at it for a project when we launched Kinship for our site, and actually really liked it. So that was kind of the impetus for this talk, and I thought I would kind of share what we learned along the way, and hopefully give you enough information to go check it out if you have a project that requires it. So I want to talk about those components a little bit. So React, probably all familiar with. It's a really pretty straightforward concept, and React components are basically what makes up Gatsby sites, and React components are made up of React components and yada, 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 all the way down. So Gatsby builds these React components and stores them in plain files styles, just like every other static site generator. But what I think is interesting about Gatsby is it also runs your static site as a single page app. So rendering at build time, super important for SEO, but rendering at runtime is also important for a dynamic performant experience. So this is kind of a typical Gatsby page. We're sort of importing some components, which we'll look at in more detail in a second. And then this is our render function with JSX, which is the kind of React-specific template language that React and, by extension, Gatsby also uses. It's like HTML, but you can mix in JavaScript for logic. And you reference your own components as opposed to just A tags or image tags. It's kind of weird, especially if you don't go to the trouble to make your own components. If you ever just reference HTML tags in this, it's going to be pretty clunky. But I think if you do use components, it allows you to think about parts of your application or your page or your site in terms of what they actually do and not just the HTML that makes them up. So components are just a great abstraction that allows for reusing across your site. So everything about the component lives in the component. And there are lots of component libraries that you can pull off NPM or publish if you create a lot of similar types of sites. And you can pass your own attributes to them. JSX calls them props. But that allows you to be really flexible in how you use these components. So we're going to take a look at the two components that we're referencing here. We have a countdown component and a hello button. And this made up a landing page that was kind of a countdown to when we launched Kinship. So this is the hello button. There's a lot going on here. But actually, back in our page, we didn't have to really care about that, right? We just said we need a hello button. Here's where it goes. And we got a lot of stuff that kind of came along for the ride. We're actually using a library called style components that embeds our styles for a component in our component, which is pretty controversial. So I'm not going to talk about it too much here. But it is pretty awesome. And I, like probably everyone else, was like, yeah, I don't know if that's a good idea. But I think the more you get into it, the more benefits you see when you can kind of put everything in here. You don't have to worry about what class was here and what's kind of going on. And you can also see it's apparently it's inheriting from outbound link, which is coming from a Gatsby plugin for Google Analytics. And the funny thing about this is actually a coworker wrote this component, and I just used it. And I had no idea that this was tracking to Google Analytics. So if I had to write that button on my own, chances are I would have forgot that we want to even track that. So that's another example of just requirements you don't have to worry about. You just know that button. Whoever wrote that button kind of set the requirements for it. You don't really have to worry about it too much. We can also see those props here. These are totally optional in React world, but being diligent about including them makes developers' lives a lot easier when they're referencing these components. Depending on your editor, it makes your autocomplete work. And there's also stuff like Storybook that would allow you to generate a whole kind of reference manual that's totally up to date with all your components and how they look. So this is the countdown timer that we mentioned. There's a little bit more going on here. It's more of a full-on React component. It references sort of the lifecycle methods of React to set a timer, generate the number of days, hours, minutes, and seconds until the countdown happens, set state, which then triggers a re-render, which allows our JSX here to update. So this is something where with Jekyll or a normal static site, and if you wanted to do this type of interactivity, you'd either have to use jQuery or you'd have to figure out how to get a React component in there. But with Gatsby, you can write just plain static pages if you want, or you can have Gatsby be the source of your React application. So this is what that content page look like with styles and all that. It was actually moving as the seconds went by. So how do you get data to a Gatsby site? We actually use GraphQL, which can kind of aggregate up data from all the plugins that you have set up in Gatsby, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second. The other kind of major component of Gatsby is webpack. Webpack is used to kind of package up all the JavaScript image and styles together. Thank goodness you don't have to interact with this or configure it yourself. I think that's one of the benefits of Gatsby, is it's kind of an opinionated framework for webpack, and you don't have to worry about it. Gatsby also uses it when building your site and when serving it during local development, so you have live reloads as you're saving and updating content. Yes?
When you were showing the code, I couldn't see what Gatsby added on top of just the classic added.
So right now it's basically nothing. I'll get to the more Gatsby specific parts in a second here, but yeah, for a lot of what you do with Gatsby is just basically React. Right? You're just writing React components that are representative of your pages, and then you're building components on top of that. Yes.
People said Gatsby is like a better green React app, so I kind of see it as like it's kind of like the little playground.
Sure.
You build the React components and stuff into it.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. I think it, if you're not intending to use the static page generation stuff that Gatsby gives you, I don't know that I would use it over Create React app, but you certainly could. They do very similar things in terms of creating opinionated environment for React. So React, GraphQL, and Webpack are very powerful, but also very complicated tools. So there again, Gatsby brings them all together in an easy-to-use package, and really provides an ecosystem that makes it easy to build performant static sites. So performance is one of the largest benefits of Gatsby. Again, when you build a Gatsby site, you're just generating HTML files just like Jekyll. But you're also getting a single-page app experience in the browser, which, if you have ever used a Gatsby site, just clicking around is like instantaneous. You almost don't know that you're moving around in a site because it's just so fast. And static sites are already pretty fast anyway. This just kind of takes it to another level. So beyond the dependencies that I mentioned, there are a lot of plugins, sort of a growing ecosystem of plugins, not to the level of WordPress or anything like that, but it's growing quickly. And there's quite a bit, so I thought I'd kind of walk through just a few examples of how these plugins can kind of be mixed and matched together. So there are plugins for fetching content from different sources, making that available through GraphQL. There are plugins for transforming content, maybe rendering HTML from Markdown or resizing images. There's plugins for styling. There's Sass and style components and all the rest. And there's a lot more, just like the Google Analytics integration we talked about earlier. So I'm just going to show you just kind of a few common scenarios, like if you want to serve Markdown files that are just plain text and style them with CSS, you can do that with just a few plugins. That would be similar to Jekyll. You could also maybe pull content from another WordPress site via its API, style it with Sass. You can even write your own plugin to pull content, like maybe from an internal API that you have that you want to create a site for, or maybe if you have content in Drupal or something like that. And I think content sources are particularly interesting to mix and match because they all sort of are aggregated and delivered to your static site via GraphQL, which is a pretty nice abstraction for just one source of content, but it's also interesting when multiple sources can also be a part of the same API. So the big caveat, of course, with static sites, and Gatsby is no exception in this, is content is pulled when you build. It's not every time you refresh the page. So there's no like load consideration you have to deal with on the server side, but you need to be cognizant of that if you are referencing data that is changing. You need to be able to refresh and rebuild your Gatsby page and reserve it wherever it needs to go. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So for Kinship, we're pulling from a CMS as a service called contentful. We're using Markdown and styling with style components. So I'm going to do a little little plug here for contentful. I don't work for them. They probably don't even know I'm telling you how awesome it is. But it is. Anybody familiar with contentful? Cool. It's a CMS, but it's only kind of the back half of a CMS. It provides the administrative interface that you would use to manage different types of content, but it doesn't render any pages for you. And it actually lets you organize your content more like a database and less like, okay, here's my page and here are some components in the page. It's a software as a service, but it does have a pretty generous free tier. And it's really great for reusing content in multiple places. So if you have specific product information or something that you want to have on your website, but also you want to have that in the mobile app, this is a good way to kind of deploy that and deliver that in multiple locations. So this is showing different types of content. So it's similar to advanced custom fields in WordPress. We have, this is the content model for Kinship.it. We have content types like posts and human, like you would have for a blog. But we also have clients and services. And they can be linked together, like you can have a relationship in a database. So posts reference authors, and if we wanted to create like a case studies type, we could reference maybe service and client and build out content that way. There are many different types of fields you can choose from. Markdown text, references. If you want to do like tags, you can do lists of text. You can upload images, which is pretty cool because Contentful has a kind of a dynamic service that allows you to resize images on the fly. So if you want to generate thumbnails, you just put a little query string w equals 150, and it'll give you 150 sized thumbnail. And of course, editing content lets you create drafts and collaborate with others, and like you would expect from the back half of a CMS. Question?
This is like CMS, right? Floating headless CMS.
Pardon?
Headless CMS.
Sure.
Right.
Yes. Is that like an open source? Okay. Yeah. Headless CMS. All right. Let's talk about getting data from Contentful or from plain text files or wherever. This is where GraphQL comes into play. So GraphQL is a query API that lets your client ask for the data it needs up front, returns it in the same shape. So if you can think of it as a JSON object with only keys, no values. Pass that query to a GraphQL server, and it gives you all the values back for those keys. Very similar to other React apps. But Gatsby takes all those content source plugins you have and creates GraphQL resolvers for each one of those. So, for example, this is how you would show all of the Contentful post types ordered by date, with slug, title, summary. And then down at the bottom, we're doing author there. And that's actually a sub-resource. So normally, if we had a REST API, we'd have to figure out a way to do this either as another request or include it somehow. Some APIs allow you to do that, but GraphQL sort of has that concept built in. One of the nice things about Gatsby is when you run Gatsby develop, it starts up a tool called GraphQL, which is a terrible name because it's so similar to the GraphQL. But it's a really nice tool that digs to kind of the power of the GraphQL inspection. GraphQL is typed, and there's an endpoint you can hit that'll give you back all the types and what they are. And if you've developed documentation for those, it'll actually show you here what kind of data you have available, and you have a nice editor with autocomplete, so you can kind of build up your pages kind of live with the data that you have. So this is kind of a more interesting example of a Gatsby page. Again, there's our components where when you create a variable called query, Gatsby is automatically going to resolve that for you when it builds that page. So here we're asking for names of all the people on our team, again from contentful. And then we're passing that to our render function, which does a little bit of JavaScript mapping to get actually at the edges of that. And then it renders that out with an unordered list. So I'm going to just do a quick kind of demo of showing how you would get a Gatsby site started. There's really not a whole lot there. We're just going to kind of use the Gatsby CLI to create a site. But I also want to show you how we deploy. We use a service called Netlify, which is, again, another free service that I'm not getting paid to plug, but it also has a pretty nice free tier that deploys your static site to a CDN. And I also want to show how we're using GitHub to kind of do continuous deployments with our Gatsby site. And I think it's a really nice way to work with both your team and also with your client to make content for your static site. So you'll need Node and NPM, which everybody probably already has. And then you just install the Gatsby CLI tool with NPM. And then you run Gatsby new. Apologies, I didn't update this for SMJS, but so this is using a generic starter site, but they're just GitHub repos. So if you're an agency and you do a bunch of static sites and you have kind of an opinion into the way you like to set them up, you could reference your own site here and kind of get started that way. So this is what that starter site looks like. This is kind of how it's a little bit different than Create React App. There's not any tests or anything like that, but there is a components directory, which has a few kind of starter components, and actually they also put their styles in here as well. There's an images directory, and then there's a pages directory. So those are mapped one-to-one basically to URLs. So the Gatsby develop command is what you would use to start that in a local server. So it's running down there at the bottom. And that also starts that GraphQL tool on the same port, but a weird URL that you can get to. This is what that default starter page looks like. Not a whole lot there. But let's kind of make some changes to that. So I'm just going to change the title here. And as you can see, like as I'm typing, it's updating in the browser, which usually that happens on save. But there's a little trick you can do with VS Code to auto-save every 100 milliseconds or so. And Gatsby is actually like quick enough to keep up with that. So I don't know if I would do that all the time, but you can actually develop kind of as you're typing, which is nice. So now that we've made our fabulous change, we just run Gatsby build, and that will generate those static files for our site. And if you were to look at them, they're basically plain text HTML. There's a lot of other stuff going on here. The assets are fingerprinted, so you can use sort of far future cache headers, and you don't have to worry about expiring those, which is helpful if you're deploying on a CDN. Gatsby did some code splitting that separates out our JavaScript files. There would be multiple versions of images here if we used the Sharp plugin to resize our images for us. But for the most part, this is just our site. We could upload a test3, we could put it on Nginx, we could FTP it to DreamHost or something. I don't know what people do these days, but it's just a site. But I think the most convenient method is to use a service that does this automatically for you every time you push. Again, I really like netlify. It will build our site for us and deploy it to a CDN. And there's all sorts of features. So there's webhooks. So if you need to rebuild your site, when something changes, you can have a URL to push to, and it will automatically repull all your data, rebuild your site. There are actions, which are basically a wrapper for AWS Lambda. So with Jamstack, you don't have a way to really interact with the user. So if you need a contact form is the canonical example. If you needed a form that you wanted to allow your visitors to leave a comment, you could use netlify's actions to kind of wire that up to actually send the email and still not have to kind of break that barrier of a static site. It also handles SSL for us via Let's Encrypt. So that's also a nice benefit. So I'm just going to show you kind of how this works. Before we set up Netlify, we'll have to create a repo. So I like Microsoft GitHub. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a good product. But I wonder if they won't rebrand. No, there's no way. So I'm just creating the repo, doing the copy and paste thing you need to do every time you set up a repo to push to it. And then I can go into Netlify and connect my GitHub to my Netlify account. First time you do that, you'll need to authenticate, obviously. But once you do that, I'm just searching for that. It found the repo. I hit push a button, and it supports all kinds of static site generators. Pardon me. But it does kind of do a fairly good job of knowing kind of what your repo has. So it suggests that we need to do a Gatsby build, which is what we want to do. So we'll go ahead with that. It takes about a minute or so the first time. Pulls NPM, does all the stuff it needs to do. Subsequent deploys are quicker. But we can see our site is now live. It gives us a random URL if we don't specify it, kind of like Heroku. In reality, you'd probably set a CNAME in your DNS so that it's actually your domain and not some random one. But now that Netlify and GitHub is all kind of hooked up and building our site, that enables a really cool workflow, I think. So I'm going to kind of show you the process for making a change. So here I'm checking out a branch, and I'm just going to change the header to reflect where we are not. Just changing the color here, and I'm actually going to change a config. It's getting the title of our site from this config file, so I'm going to change that. That updates the header. We will commit that. For some reason, I went to the trouble of writing a nice commit message, even for this demo. Just showing good practices. You don't want to just say. So pushing that branch to GitHub now. And then now we can create a pull request for that. So now that we've created the branch, submitted the pull request, at this point we may want to tell somebody else on our team that we want them to take a look at this before we merge it. But in the background, Netlify, because it added that webhook to our repo, it's automatically building a preview for us, which is going to take a few seconds here. But when that build process is successful, and if it's not, you'll get links to the output so you can debug if there's some sort of issue. But assuming everything works out, in a few seconds, you will get a link in the bottom part there with a URL that is unique to that pull request. So it's our site, but only at that pull request. It's a weird, like, deploy preview 1 URL. So That's super handy if you're a developer who needs to look at this pull request, because you don't have to pull the branch down and, you know, do NVM because it's a different version, whatever, all the stuff you have to do. And it's also handy if you want to send that to a client and say, I made this change, what do you think? I think it's a really good workflow for managing static sites. The other place that's helpful is if you are doing kind of, if you're not using contentful, if you just have blog posts, say, in a markdown file in that GitHub repo, you can actually use GitHub as kind of a makeshift content editor. So you can create the markdown file in the GitHub UI, write some markdown, see the preview, show it to other members of your team, and kind of do a blog or team journal or something that way. I wouldn't recommend that for most content creator people, just because it's GitHub and it's not a nice UI, but it does work for tech-minded folks. So that was just a few short minutes, and there's a lot more possible. The Gatsby documentation is really good. It's a Gatsby site, as you would have probably guessed. And there's tutorials that kind of start where I started, but then go way down into more advanced things. Like I didn't really cover how to create pages from data. So we looked at that pages directory, and there was 3 things in there, and they all had slugs to a page. But if you actually want to create that dynamically, there's some more JavaScript stuff you have to do, and this sort of walks you through how you might do that. Also, I think the list of plugins is pretty interesting to kind of go through. It's listed in popularity there, so just to kind of get an idea for some of the things that are possible. Any questions? Yes.
If my services are not GraphQL,
so it depends on the service. So for some things, there are kind of wrappers already, if it's something generic. But if it's not, you'd have to write a plugin to kind of make it a GraphQL service. Right. Well, you could do it either way. You could, if it was a Gatsby only thing, like if you had some REST API or something you wanted to expose just to Gatsby, you could kind of create a wrapper that would run within Gatsby, or you could write a GraphQL service. There's actually a lot of like point your database to this thing, and it creates a GraphQL service for you. So in some cases that could work. Otherwise, you'd have to create a GraphQL service. Any other questions? Yes.
It's kind of more like you're talking like a client site or something like that. This is very much developed workflow, right? Is there any way to like make it so that it's easy for the client to deploy it without having to write like some custom logic for it? You're not expecting that to pull it much necessarily. Right.
So I think that's where something like contentful is helpful, because yeah, if they needed to like say that list of clients, if you had a new client and you wanted to add a new one, they could go in there and update that, and then when they publish that, there's ways to do previews in contentful too, which is nice, similar to how we did in GitHub. But you know, once that's published, then that kicks off the build to generate a new site that would be updated with their content. Yes.
Two more questions. What's your least favorite feature of Gatsby and why? And what feature is Gatsby missing you would add? Why?
That's a good question. To be honest, I think you know, full disclosure, I don't work every day like building sites that Gatsby uses, which is ironic. This is like the talk that I'm giving. But it worked really well for the use case of the site for our agency. So I am not really in it and not really pushing the limits of it probably day to day like other people are. But I do think, I think the one wrinkle right now is I think it's weird to create pages from data. You have to go in and do some JavaScript stuff, and I think that could maybe be a little bit easier. But the APIs and everything for interacting with it, I think, are pretty clean. It's not like a super non-developer friendly tool for that. But, Yes?
Who's developing and maintaining Gatsby?
So there is a group of people that were doing it as a free open source thing, but just like everything else in Silicon Valley, they got venture capital funding. So we'll see what happens. They are, I think, working on sort of a Gatsby as a service product. I'm not really sure what their intentions are for, justifying their millions of dollars of valuation. But they do seem pretty committed to keeping the product open source, and hopefully it allows them to grow. I mean, I think they're sort of looking at WordPress as a competitor, and just the ecosystem for WordPress is huge, and I think there's plenty of opportunity for them to kind of grow that space, but grow it more dynamically with kind of React in mind, and kind of looking at some of the features that React can bring in terms of more dynamic, static experiences, if that makes sense.
Are they open source and open contribution, or are they like SQL, like where it's open source but you can't contribute?
Open source, open contribution. And as far as I know, there's no like community and pro versions or anything like that. It's just all one right now. But that's a good question. I should look into more.
Slack if you contribute to it. So I think that's why he's giving this talk.
I haven't done that yet. They did do a store, which I just sort of wanted to check out because it was written in Gatsby, and I'm like, well, how do you do an e-commerce store with a static site? But they used the Shopify. So Shopify has a GraphQL API. So they built a shopping cart experience on top of their static Gatsby site. And it was actually like surprisingly like the best checkout experience I've ever used, because it was like I added something to my cart, I clicked OK, I was allowed to use Apple Pay on Safari, which almost never happens, and I ordered something in like a minute, which was crazy. But yes, if you do submit a PR, you can get credits to get free stuff, but you should probably do that. Yes?
So what is the use case for a static site? Is it purely performance?
I think performance and just ease of, certainly cost of hosting. If you have a really popular WordPress blog, you have to spend quite a bit on hosting because you have to have a database and you have to have fancy caching layers and all that sort of stuff. So I think people are attracted to static sites because you can just put it on a stupid static file server or a CDN or S3 on CloudFront and host a site for pennies as opposed to, even $20 a month, right? Because it's doing so little on the runtime. Yes?
I just want to add a little anecdote about performance.
Sure.
Since they've got this weird cool thing where the user goes and passes over a link, and it in the background triggers an async request for the data that they're going to get when they click on it. And since it's static and it might be 40 milliseconds, that data is probably there before they click. So it really is instantaneous to using that sort of Gatsby site.
So just to repeat that briefly, there is one of the optimizations they do is when you hover over a link, it like prefetches it before you click, so that again it seems like super fast when you actually do click it. Yes.
We use a lot of webpack stuff for like enterprise stuff, so that it's really good for like India and China because of like their data policies being like expensive or whatever. It's like a very minimal site. It's only one page to generate.
Right, which is also helpful for like CDN, CDNs, because you can host that static site in a CDN really easy, and it's kind of fast everywhere. Yes?
Are there use cases that where it might not be a good idea to use a static site?
I think if you do have a lot of interactivity, or you need to, you don't want to write a bunch of React components to build a site, I wouldn't use it. If it's something like where you needed sort of real-time information, but you didn't have an API to give you that and sort of update it, I wouldn't use it because, again, you have to, you're only going to get new data every time you either have an API on the page to give you that new data or you rebuild the site.
Questions? Search and comments are the two things that are classically really annoying to do in Jekyll. Does Gatsby have a good solution for doing that, or do you have to use a database?
You'd probably have to, I wouldn't say use a database, I'd say you'd have to use a service, whether that's Algolia is one of them. But there's a lot of kind of like search as a service things you'd have to plug into. There are some like Lucene in JavaScript kind of things, or Solar in JavaScript that could potentially work, but I haven't explored that. Yes.
I would like a plugin thing. All the other plugins for them. Like pop search for like a company that does it, and they already have plugins.
So there's plugins to help with that. Anything else? Cool. Well, thank you again for your time. I am Kevin Marsh. If you have any questions or want to reach out and talk, or you want us to build you something or help us build stuff for other people, here's my email address. And I just want to thank you for your attention. And I appreciate your feedback. This is my third time talking about this, and probably to the biggest group. So I definitely appreciate all of your time this evening.
Thanks, Al. If you happen to think of questions that you can ask for the JetBrains license and the free t-shirts. The first one we'll do is for the JetBrains license. The way this works is raise your hand and I will call on you. Please don't shout out the answer. Then it's real hard to tell who answered first.
So I mentioned the name of the stack that all this stuff is kind of like referred to as. What's the name of that stack?
Jamstack.
Yes.
Jamstack? All right, Jamstack. That was the first. That was for the JetBrains. Go up and give me your email address afterwards. The next one will be for a t-shirt. You have one more question to ask.
Who wrote the book, The Great Gatsby? Very good.
All right, you get a t-shirt. Cool. Thanks again. I hope to see you all at MASH after this. We'll hang out here for a few minutes, but then head over there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.